Out here in the Arizona Territory, folks learn to read the world the way other people read a newspaper. You watch the sky, you taste the air, you listen to the wind like it's trying to tell you a secret it can't keep. That evening, the sky had the color of old iron, dull, heavy, and mean. A spring storm was pushing in fast, dragging sand across the flats like it meant to scrub the land clean. My little way station sat where the trail ran thin between nowhere and nowhere else, a low adobe shed, a leaning corral, and a sign that said water, so faded it looked embarrassed to still be standing. I stepped outside with a tin cup of coffee, mostly because the mules were acting wrong. They'd pressed together in the corral, ears pinned back, like they could hear something I couldn't. In my line of work, when animals get quiet, it's because trouble is talking. The wind came in gusts, sharp and gritty. Sand stung my cheeks and got between my teeth. I squinted into the haze, and that's when I saw him. At first, he was only a shape moving through the storm, a rider on a big horse, coming straight at the station as if the wind owed him passage. The horse looked tired down to the bone, its mane stiff with grit, but it kept coming. The rider sat upright, hat pulled low, shoulders squared like he'd decided to stay solid no matter what the world threw at him. Then the storm shifted, and the light caught the thing around his neck. A rope, not coiled on the saddle, not tied to a pack, hanging from his throat like a bad joke the devil hadn't finished telling. It slapped against his chest with every step the horse took, steady as a clock you don't want in the room. And beside the horse, running through the blowing sand, was a boy. A Dene boy, Navajo, maybe 12 or 13, barefoot, quick as a coyote, not wasting a single movement. He kept pace like it was nothing, one hand reaching out now and then to touch the horse's flank, just a light tap like he was borrowing strength or making sure the animal didn't decide to quit. I'll admit it, my first instinct was to step back into the doorway and close it. A man doesn't see a rope on a living rider and think, well, this should be a pleasant evening. The rider drew up, and his eyes met mine, pale eyes, the color of creek water over stones. His throat was raw where hemp had bitten, lips cracked from thirst and wind, but there was nothing weak about him. He spoke like the storm had tried and failed to take his voice. "Evening," he said. "If you're selling water, I'll buy. If you're selling lies, I'm full up." I stared at the rope like it might explain itself. You got a rope on you." He blinked once. I noticed. "You been hung," he said, like he was telling me the weather. Then he added, "Name's John Town." That name landed heavier than the storm. I'd heard it, passed along in saloons and trading posts, in the careful way men share stories that might get 'em killed if they share 'em too loud. John Town, a U.S. Marshal once, or a man who wore a badge long enough to learn what it costs. My eyes flicked to the boy. "And him?" The boy didn't answer. He didn't speak English, or if he did, he didn't want to use it. He watched my hands instead, then the water barrel, then the horizon, like he was deciding which direction danger was most likely to come from. John Town followed the boy's look. He doesn't speak your language, but he understands hunger and gunfire just fine. The wind slammed sand into the walls. I could feel the storm pressing against the station like it wanted inside. I should have said no, but the sight of that rope and that boy and that horse standing there on stubborn legs, it did something to me. "Storm's bad," I said. "You can wait it out inside." John's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Careful, friend. You invite a man in, you might end up responsible for him." I muttered, I'm responsible for my own roof and for not dying of thirst, and I stepped aside. Inside, the air smelt like beans and mule sweat and old smoke. A lantern hung on a nail, rocking slightly, throwing shadows that swayed like nervous people. John Town slid down from the saddle and came in slow, carrying the weight of a man who shouldn't be standing. The rope swung with him. The boy stayed near the wall, not sitting, not relaxing, eyes tracking corners. I went back to my pot, stirring beans I didn't feel like eating. My hands moved, but my mind stayed on that rope. A man doesn't carry a noose mark and keep moving unless something inside him is driving harder than fear. After a while, John's voice came quiet from the shadow. "Tomas." I looked over. "Yeah? If you hear riders tonight," he said, "don't light another lamp." My stomach tightened. "You expecting company?" He looked at the lantern flame like it offended him. In my experience, the desert doesn't give second chances without charging interest. Outside, the wind moaned through the corral slats, long and almost human. Sand rattled the shutters. The mules shifted again, and I realized they weren't afraid of the storm. They were afraid of what the storm could hide. The boy's head lifted sharply at a sound I couldn't place. John's hand moved, slow, practiced, toward the gun at his hip. No panic, just readiness, like he'd lived most of his life one breath away from violence. And standing there with my spoon in my hand, I understood something plain as daylight. I hadn't just offered shelter to strangers. I'd let a story into my house. A story with a rope as a necklace, a boy that didn't speak but watched everything, and a name, Jacone, that tasted like blood even when you whispered it. Out here, stories don't knock politely. They come in with the wind.
By the time dawn showed up, the storm didn't end so much as it got tired. The wind still had a temper, but it had less strength behind it, like an old drunk arguing with a door that won't open. A pale strip of light slid up behind the mesas, and the desert started looking like itself again. Hard ground, stubborn brush, and distance that could swallow a man whole. John Town woke first. Not the kind of waking a rested man does, more like he'd been holding his breath all night and finally decided he couldn't afford to anymore. He rose off the bedroll slow, joints stiff, eyes already scanning the room like sleep was something that happened to other people. He checked his revolver, then checked it again, the way a man touches a scar to make sure it's still there. The boy stood up too, silent as smoke. He stretched the stiffness out of his legs and moved like someone who'd learned early to not waste motion. What I noticed most were his feet, bare, cracked, tough as boot leather. There was an old scar around one ankle, thin and pale, like a rope burn that the years couldn't quite erase. I put beans in a tin bowl and slid it toward him. "Eat," I told him. He watched me a moment, measuring, deciding. Then he ate fast, but neat, no crumbs left behind. When he was done, he wiped the bowl with a piece of bread, as if wasting even a smear of food might make the world angry. John ate standing by the doorway, rope still hanging on his neck like an unfinished sentence. When he finished, he didn't thank me with big words. He just looked up and asked, "How far to the next settlement?" "Half a day, if you don't get shot." He nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable condition. "And Jacone?" I shrugged. "Men say he's up near Black Rock Canyon, trading in the high country." John's hand went to the rope at his throat. He shifted it so it wouldn't catch on his coat. "You're selling rifles," he said, "and you're buying time." I studied him a second and asked what had been gnawing at me. "You a marshal still?" He gave me a look that wasn't angry, just tired of the question. "He's a man with a badge in my pocket and a new scar on my throat." "That ain't an answer," I muttered. "It's the only one you get," he replied. Then we stepped outside. The air felt rinsed, but the ground was already drying. The desert doesn't mourn weather, it just moves on. John swung into the saddle with the weight of a man who'd been carried by horses, more than luck. And the boy, he started forward at a run, like that was simply how he traveled. Not showing off, not trying to impress, just moving the way his body knew best. I called out, "Boy!" He stopped, but he didn't fully turn. He kept one shoulder angled toward the horizon, the way wild things do when they're deciding whether you're safe. I tapped my chest. "Tomas," I said. Then I pointed at him, raising my brows like, "Go on, tell me." He hesitated, just a breath, then tapped his own sternum and spoke a word in Diné, soft, clear, and impossible for my tongue. I tried to repeat it and failed so badly his lips twitched, almost a smile, gone before it had a chance to live. John looked down at him. "You got a name," he said. "We all do, even if we don't like it." The boy didn't answer. His jaw tightened. His eyes went away from John, away from me, straight to the open country, where a hawk circled without flapping, riding the air like it owned the day. John sighed through his nose, like he decided not to fight that battle yet. "Fine," he said, "keep it, but I'll need to call you something when things go bad." The boy didn't give him anything, not even a glance. John tipped his hat to me. "Appreciate the water." I nodded. "Try not to bring the storm back with you." He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "No promises." And then they left, horse, rope, and boy, moving east until the desert swallowed them. I stood in the doorway longer than I meant to, telling myself I was just being cautious. Truth is, I'd seen too many men ride out with purpose and not enough ride back. From what I heard later, and from what the desert tends to do when it wants a story told, John pushed hard through the morning. By midday, the sun was pressing down like a hand. The horse started foaming at the mouth, tired and angry about it. The boy didn't run as much now. Sometimes he walked, sometimes he trotted, never asking for rest, never begging for mercy, just moving. They reached a shallow wash where the ground was scored with wagon ruts. John slid off the horse and crouched, reading the dirt like it was scripture. 2 wagons, heavy load, plenty of men, fresh trail. The boy squatted beside him and pointed at a small round indentation. John followed it. Boot heel. Good eye. The boy had that kind of attention, the kind you get when your life depends on seeing trouble early. John shaded his eyes and spotted a thin smear of smoke far off on the horizon. Not thick, not a campfire meant for comfort, more like the remains of something already done. They moved faster. As the land rose into rougher country, the world turned black and twisted, basalt, rock, and bent juniper, shadows tucked into every crease. Late light warmed the stone, but the wind still came in sharp little jabs. And then they found the reason for that smoke. A wagon lay on its side like a dead animal, canvas slit open, crates smashed. A mule nearby, legs stiff, eyes filmed over. Flies doing their busy work the way they always do when men decide someone doesn't get to go home. John walked around it slow, not touching anything first. He didn't need to. The ground told him enough. Too many footprints, too hurried, drag marks like something heavy had been pulled away. The boy drifted to the far side and froze. That's when they saw the body. A man half hidden behind rocks, throat cut, one hand still clutching a scrap of paper. Death had stiffened his fingers around it, like the message mattered more than his life. John knelt careful and pried the paper free. He read it quick, folded it, and tucked it away. From the way his face tightened, he didn't like what it said. He only had to speak one word for the boy to understand the shape of the danger. Jacone. By the time dusk came, they were up on a ridge looking down into a basin, and down there, like rot in a wound, was a camp. Tents, wagons, horses, men moving in silhouettes against firelight, rifles stacked in neat lines. Too neat, too confident. John counted bodies the way a man counts bullets when he knows he won't have enough. And then he saw it. An iron cage on a wagon bed. Inside, something shifted. Someone. The boy made a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a word. Something in him recognized that cage the way a dog recognizes the smell of blood. John looked at him quiet. "Do you know who that is?" The boy didn't answer, but his whole body leaned forward, tight as a drawn bow. Whatever was in that cage mattered to him in the deepest way. Not curiosity, not pity, something personal. Below them, laughter rose. A man stepped into the firelight, broad-shouldered, well-dressed for the desert, hair slicked back. He held a bottle as if he was hosting a party instead of a crime. Even from a distance, John Town recognized him. Jacone. The kind of man who smiled like a priest and dealt like a card sharp. The kind of man who could hang someone and still sleep fine afterward. Jacone lifted his bottle as if making a toast to the night. Then he walked to the cage and tapped it with his knuckles, like he was checking the quality of merchandise. The figure inside flinched. John's hand went to his revolver, then stopped. Too many men, too much open ground, and beside him, a boy with nothing but a knife and a storm in his chest. "We do it right," he whispered, "or we don't do it at all." Down in the camp, Jacone leaned close to the cage and said something they couldn't hear. Then he drew a pistol and fired once into the dirt, close enough to make the captive collapse back in panic. The outlaws roared with laughter like it was the finest entertainment in the world. On the ridge, the boy trembled. John's anger didn't shake. It settled, cold, deep, old, like the kind that stays awake even when the body tries to sleep. He put one hand on the boy's shoulder. Not gentle, not soft, just steady, a wordless anchor. And as the night deepened and the fires burned lower, something else drifted across the basin. A whistle. Not a man's whistle, not a bird, a single thin note that rose and fell like grief trying not to be heard. Men in the camp paused, heads turned. Even laughter can get nervous in the wrong wind. Jacone tilted his head and listened, amused, as if the desert itself had told a joke. Then the sound stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than the heat. John's eyes narrowed. "We move before dawn," he whispered. The boy stared down at the cage as if
Folks around here like to say the desert is empty. That's a lie people tell when they haven't been alone in it long enough. The desert is full of wind, full of distance, full of the kind of silence that makes a man hear his own thoughts too clearly. And that morning, right before first light, it was full of danger. John Town and that Navajo boy watched Jacone's camp from the rocks until the night finally started to thin. The fires below burned low, the men down there moving slower, heavy with whiskey and certainty. They looked like they owned the earth they stood on. Men like that always do. John had a plan, simple in the way desperate plans are simple. Get the captive out, steal a horse, vanish into the high country before Jacone could gather himself and give chase. No speeches, no heroics, just a clean cut and a hard ride. The boy stayed close, quiet as a shadow. His eyes were bright, not with fear, but with something sharper. He moved like a kid who'd learned that hesitation costs more than pride. They slid down into a narrow draw, using stone and brush for cover. The cold air tasted like ash and old smoke. John kept checking angles, counting men in his head, measuring the open ground they'd have to cross like it was a punishment waiting to happen. Then the captive screamed. It wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic, just a sudden choked sound, like the air got pulled out of her and she couldn't decide whether to fight for it. John froze in mid-step. The boy stiffened beside him like a snapped wire. Down in the camp, men shouted and moved. Boots scuffed dirt. A rifle cracked once, not aimed at John, not aimed at the boy, just fired like a warning to remind someone what kind of world they were in. And then John saw why. Jacone was standing by the iron cage with an iron rod in his hand, tapping it lazy, like a man checking a fence post.
The woman inside the cage was pressed back against the bars, bruised, terrified, trying to make herself smaller than she was. Jacone leaned in like he was telling her a secret, then slid the rod between the bars. The way she recoiled, it wasn't just fear. It was the kind of fear that comes from knowing you're helpless and someone is enjoying it. The boy made a sound under his breath, half growl, half grief, and he surged forward. John grabbed his arm hard, not gentle, not comforting, just a firm clamp that said, "You do this now and you die in the open." The boy fought it for a heartbeat, then stopped, not because the anger was gone, but because he understood death better than most grown men. John whispered to him, low and tight, that they'd do it right or they wouldn't do it at all. And the desert, like it had been listening, handed them an opening. A wagon wheel groaned, then snapped. A crate tipped off the wagon bed and burst open. Cartridges spilled out across the dirt, bright brass catching the first weak light like coins thrown on a grave. The man on the wagon cursed and jumped down, scrambling to gather them, and men laughed. Heads turned, attention loosened, just for a moment. John's eyes sharpened. He breathed one word, almost nothing. Now. He slid behind a feed trough, rose just enough to fire, and dropped the man guarding the horse line with one clean shot. The camp exploded into movement. Shouts, boots, hands reaching for rifles, dust kicked up in sudden little storms. And the boy ran. Not toward the horses like John needed him to, toward the cage. John cursed, quietly, because cursing is what a man does when he knows the world isn't going to listen anyway. He fired again, taking down a second guard. Bullets snapped through the air and punched dust from the ground. Somewhere, someone yelled Jacone's name like it was a prayer. The boy reached the cage and jammed his knife into the lock. The blade bent slightly. He grunted and tried again, twisting harder. The metal resisted like it had its own stubbornness. Jacone turned toward him with surprise that quickly became delight. Even from a distance, you could tell Jacone liked this. He liked fear. He liked spectacle. He liked watching other people make mistakes. "Well," Jacone called out, easy as a man greeting company, "what have we got here?" John fired at Jacone. Jacone stepped aside like he'd been expecting it, and the bullet smacked into a wagon post. John's teeth clenched. 10 men, rifles, open ground, a boy at a cage with a knife, a woman inside shaking like she'd already started to die. John ran. He didn't run like a young man. He ran like a man who'd been hanged once and refused to be hanged again. Rope bouncing against his chest, lungs burning, boots tearing up grit. He reached the cage just as Jacone's pistol came up. John slammed his shoulder into the side of the cage, putting himself between the boy and the line of fire. He fired twice at the men converging. One dropped near the fire. Another stumbled behind a wagon wheel. The boy drove the knife into the lock again, this time with both hands, twisting with everything he had. The lock finally gave with a metallic shriek. The door sprang open. The woman fell forward into the dust. John grabbed her arm and hauled her up like she weighed nothing. "Run," he snapped, and pointed toward the horses. He didn't know her name yet, didn't need it. Names could come later, survival couldn't. They ran through chaos, through shouting and smoke and the stink of sweat and gunpowder. The boy vaulted onto a small dun horse like he'd been born on saddle leather. The woman scrambled to another horse, clinging to the saddle horn, eyes wide. John cut a lead rope with his knife and swung into his own saddle, bullets punching dirt close enough to sting. They burst out of the camp and into open ground. Behind them, Jacone's men mounted up fast. Horses screamed, rifles cracked. The chase began like a storm finding its direction. John chose routes that punished pursuit. Ravines, broken stone, narrow gaps where a horse could snap a leg if the rider got careless. He rode hard, not pretty. The boy kept pace, riding like he had no doubt the horse would do what he asked. The woman, later they'd learn her name was Elena, held on the way drowning people hold on, with their whole soul. By late day, the land rose up into rougher cuts, black rock and steep gullies. The air cooled, but the danger stayed hot. Eventually, the pursuers fell back, some slowed by fear of the terrain, some by smarter instincts than bravery. When John finally stopped, he didn't stop because it was safe. He stopped because bodies and horses have limits. They found a shallow cave under an overhang. The woman collapsed inside, shaking like the ground might open. The boy hovered near the entrance, knife ready, eyes scanning the open land as if the night might expect to crawl in. John listened to the wind, and in the way he held still, you could tell he'd spent a lifetime listening for the moment the world turns violent. John asked the woman her name. She swallowed hard and whispered, "Elena." John nodded once, filing it away like a fact. "All right, Elena."
Willow Bend wasn't much of a town, but it had enough buildings to convince a stranger it was civilized. And in the territory, civilized usually just meant the roofs were closer together. It sat along a shallow river that only bothered to run when it felt like it. A saloon with a porch and a tired set of swinging doors. A general store with a little bell over the entrance. A church that leaned toward its graveyard like it was already thinking ahead. And up on a low rise beyond the last houses, a schoolhouse stood apart from everything else, like it didn't want to be associated with the town, or like the town didn't want to admit it was there. Johntown brought the boy and the woman in at dusk, using a backtrack so fewer eyes could count them. It didn't work. Towns have eyes the way the desert has wind. Everywhere, even when you swear there's nothing moving. A kid sweeping outside the saloon stopped mid-stroke and stared at the rope around John's neck. A woman with a basket froze when she saw the Navajo boy, then hurried away without looking back. Two men on the sheriff's porch watched like they were measuring how far a body might travel if it fell. Elena kept her head down, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, trying to look like she belonged to the shadows. The boy rode close behind John, eyes working every rooftop and alley gap, as if danger might step out from behind a barrel. John didn't wander. He went straight for the general store. Inside, the air smelled like flour and leather and money. A man behind the counter looked up and smiled too fast, the kind of smile that shows up when the heart hasn't agreed to it. "Evening," the storekeeper said, voice tight. "What can I do for you?" "Ammo. Coffee. Bandages." The storekeeper nodded quickly, then his eyes slid to the boy. His mouth opened like he was about to say something ugly or cowardly. John's hand settled flat on the counter. Not a slam, just a calm, heavy placement that said, "You're going to choose your next words carefully." "You do," John said, quiet and final. The storekeeper swallowed and began pulling supplies like a man packing a suitcase for someone else's funeral. Elena hovered near the doorway, blanket drawn tight. She whispered to John, low and urgent, that the storekeeper would tell the sheriff. John didn't even look up. He said, "Let him." And that was the thing about Johntown. He wasn't reckless. He was just done pretending the world could be handled gently. Boots sounded outside, measured, confident. The bell above the door jingled. Sheriff Laird stepped in. He was tall and sun-browned, with a mustache groomed like he expected photographs. His badge was bright in the lamplight, and his eyes moved over the room like a man reads a ledger, quick, efficient, already adding up what you're worth. "Well," he said, mild as warm milk, "you're either the bravest fool I've seen this month, or you're Johntown." John's face didn't change. "Evening, Sheriff." The sheriff's gaze lingered on Elena. "And who's this?" Elena flinched like the question had hands. John answered for her. "A traveler who got mixed up with the wrong people." Sheriff Laird's eyebrow rose slightly, as if he enjoyed the smell of a secret. "You and Jacone close, Sheriff." The store seemed to shrink. Even the shelves felt like they were leaning in to listen. The Navajo boy's fingers tightened on Elena's blanket, protective and ready. John saw this and didn't tell him to stop. He only watched the sheriff. "You and Jacone close, Sheriff?" John asked. Laird chuckled, almost friendly. "I'm close with whoever keeps my town breathing. You'd be surprised what a town needs." John's eyes narrowed. "I'm not surprised by much anymore." The sheriff's gaze drifted again, taking in the rope around John's neck like it was a detail he might use later. "You want to buy supplies, you buy them. You want to start trouble, you do it outside. But you don't bring a Navajo boy and a bruised girl into Willow Bend and expect folks to notice." John leaned in just slightly. "Notice all you want," he said. "Just don't touch them." And that's when the sheriff's calm turned sharper. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift like a knife turning in the hand. "Here's what'll happen. You'll come with me. We'll have a talk, then you can be on your way in the morning." John didn't move. "No." One word, soft, but it filled the whole store like smoke. Laird's smile dropped away. "Then I'll take you in irons." John's hand drifted toward his holster. Not drawing, just honest about where this could go. Through the store window, men outside shifted their weight, ready to become brave as soon as it was safe to be brave. John glanced once toward Elena and the boy. He'd dragged them into town. If bullets started flying, they'd be the ones paying for it. He exhaled slow. "Fine," he said at last. "We'll talk." The boy took a half step forward, eyes bright with alarm. John turned to him and spoke quietly, like an order and a promise at the same time. "Stay." The boy didn't like it. You could see it in his jaw. But he understood strategy. He'd survived long enough to recognize when fighting now meant dying fast. Sheriff Laird gestured toward the door. "After you." John walked out with the sheriff beside him, ropes swinging against his coat with every step. Townsfolk watched from porches and windows, faces pretending not to care. That's how a town survives, sometimes, by practicing blindness. Behind them, Elena stood in the doorway, clutching her blanket. The boy stared after John like an invisible tether had been pulled tight. And then the wind shifted. Up on the hill, from that dark schoolhouse that sat apart from everything, a thin hymn drifted down. Child voices, soft and steady. It should have sounded comforting. It didn't. The Navajo boy looked up at the hill, and his shoulders tightened, the way they had on the ridge above Jacone's camp. Like that song wasn't a lullaby. Like it was a net. Somewhere behind one of the schoolhouse windows, a lantern moved, slow, deliberate, then vanished. The singing wavered, then carried on, thinner than before. Elena followed the boy's gaze, and whatever she saw in that building made her sick with memory. Down on the street, Johntown disappeared into the sheriff's office, and Willow Bend, with its porches and planks and polite faces, did what frontier towns do best. It pretended to sleep while trouble settled in for the night.
People later told it like a joke, the way folks do when something scares them and they don't want to admit it. They said Willow Bend's sheriff kept his office so clean you could eat off the floor. They said the lamp in there burned steady all night, like it didn't believe in shadows. But there wasn't anything funny about it. Sheriff Laird walked Johntown into that office and shut the door with the care of a man closing a jewelry box. One oil lamp sat on the desk, throwing a warm circle of light across polished wood and neat paperwork. It also threw a hard shadow from the rope still hanging around John's neck, like the noose had followed him indoors and decided to get comfortable. Laird sat down and folded his hands, looking John over the way a rancher looks at a horse he might buy. John didn't take the chair Laird offered. He stayed standing, dust on his coat, grit in his beard, eyes pale and steady. "You're making my evening complicated," he said, calm as a sermon. John's voice came back flat. "That's your job." Laird's smile thinned, and he reached into a desk drawer. When he slid the paper out and laid it on the desk, he did it gently, like he expected the document to bite. It was official looking, crisp, stamped, signed, the kind of thing that could ruin a man without firing a single shot. Laird tapped it once, then again. "Paperwork is a rope you can't cut with a knife," he said. John didn't touch it. He just stared at it like it was a different kind of weapon. "You keep records for Jacone now, he asked. Laird leaned back, the lamplight catching his badge. He keep records for Willow Bend, he said. Chacon keeps the town supplied. Guns, flour, whiskey. You'd be surprised what a town needs. John's jaw tightened. The school, he said, not a question. For a brief second, something in Laird's eyes flickered. Irritation, maybe, or pride. He shrugged it off like dust. Respectable money. And then Laird's tone changed. Not louder, just colder. Chacon rides in before sunrise. He'll want a word with you. After that, you'll be gone. John's eyes narrowed. Gone how? Laird's shoulders rose in a lazy little shrug. Perhaps you'll become one of them. John's hand drifted toward his holster. Not fast, not dramatic, just honest. Laird didn't flinch. He simply turned his head and called, like he was ordering coffee, "Deputy." A back door creaked and two men stepped out with rifles. Hard faces, sleepless eyes. The office suddenly felt smaller. John's hand stopped moving. "Take his gun," Laird said. John let them do it. He didn't fight, because the fight he wanted wasn't in that room. The deputy lifted John's revolver away and set it aside like it was something harmless. John watched their hands the way he'd watch a snake sliding into grass. Laird leaned forward, voice softer now, almost friendly. "You should have kept moving when you crawled off that rope. Men like you can't stand unfinished things." John's gaze stayed on him. "And men like you can't stand looking in a mirror too long," John said. That earned him a tight look, not quite anger, not quite respect. Laird stood up and nodded toward the back. "Put him in the cell." They marched John down the short hall and into a holding cell that didn't get much lamplight. Iron bars, a narrow bench, shadows pooling in the corners like they had weight. The door clanged shut and the sound echoed through the building as if the wood itself approved. John sat on the bench with his back straight, not slumped, not broken. He listened, because that's what men like him do when the world tries to put them away. He listened to the floorboards, the walls, the town outside, the wind sliding down the empty street. Up on the hill, that thin hymn drifted again, children's voices, steady and small. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. It sounded like something practiced, something learned under threat. Outside the sheriff's office, Willow Bend pretended to sleep. But down at the general store, Elena and the Navajo boy didn't sleep at all. The storekeeper had gone pale and kept muttering about not wanting trouble, which in a place like Willow Bend usually meant he already belonged to it. Elena stood wrapped in her blanket, wringing the edge of it until her fingers looked white. She kept glancing toward the sheriff's office as if she could see through wood. The boy watched everything: windows, alleys, rooftops. When Elena's whispered that the sheriff would kill John, the boy didn't understand her words, but he understood her eyes. Fear has a way of translating itself. He looked up the hill toward the schoolhouse. A lantern moved behind one of the windows, slow and deliberate. Then the light vanished. The hymn faltered for a moment and returned thinner, like someone had tightened the fist around it. Elena followed his gaze and swallowed hard. "That place," she murmured, and her voice did something strange, like memory had grabbed it by the throat. The boy made a small gesture with his hand, 2 fingers walking, then a quick slice across his throat. Danger. The kind of danger that doesn't wear a gun belt to announce itself. Elena nodded barely. "See," she whispered. "Danger everywhere." The boy started moving through the side streets, staying close to walls, stepping where boards wouldn't creak. Elena hesitated only a heartbeat before following. She didn't like the idea of sneaking back into a town that already wanted her gone, but she liked the idea of leaving John in that cell even less. And here's what people forget when they tell the story later. The boy didn't head straight for the sheriff's office. Not at first. He turned toward the hill again, like that hymn was pulling on something inside him. Like the schoolhouse wasn't just a building, like it was a trap dressed up as salvation. The wind slipped down off the rise and through the empty street, carrying dust and that thin childlike singing. And somewhere in the dark, the lamp in Sheriff Laird's office kept burning steady, clean, warm, and patient. waiting for sunrise and the man named Jacone. The path up to the schoolhouse cut through scrub and stones, and the moon hung thin above it all, sharp as a fingernail, cold as a coin left outside overnight. The Navajo boy climbed without hurrying, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he understood something most grown men forget. Speed makes noise, and noise invites attention. Elena struggled behind him, her breath loud in the quiet. She was wrapped in that blanket like it could hide her bruises, like it could hide her from the kind of people who collect bruises the way others collect money. But the blanket didn't fool the night, and it didn't fool the boy either. He kept moving, eyes fixed on the dark building at the top of the hill. Up close, the schoolhouse looked bigger than it had from town. Pale wooden walls, dark windows, a cross nailed above the door, more warning than comfort. The wind slid around it and made the place feel hollow, like it was built to keep something in, not to welcome anyone. The boy crouched under a side window and lifted himself just enough to look inside. Elena crept up beside him and did the same, and whatever she saw made her clap her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Inside were rows of narrow cots, children lying stiff, faces turned toward the wall, hair cut short like someone was trying to trim away the past. A lantern burned low, and the man walked between beds holding a strap. He didn't swing it. He didn't have to. He let it drag across the floorboards, slow and steady, and that sound did the talking for him. At the far end of the room, behind the half-open door, a small shape sat upright and rocked gently, as if the body remembered motion even when the mind had shut down. The boy's fingers curled tight against the window frame. Elena whispered that they couldn't do anything, couldn't take anyone, couldn't fight a whole building. But before she could finish the thought, a floorboard inside creaked. The strap stopped dragging. The man turned his head toward the window like he'd smelled them. Elena froze so hard she might have turned into stone. The boy dropped down instantly and pulled her with him. Both of them pressed flat to the wall, breathing through their teeth. A door opened inside. Lantern light spilled out in a thin wedge, and the woman's voice followed, brisk, controlled, used to being obeyed. Someone asked if the man had heard something again. He answered no, but his voice didn't sound sure. Then the woman said something that made Elena's eyes widen even in the dark. She spoke about children drawing trouble, and then she mentioned a shipment coming. A shipment. Not visitors, not supplies. A shipment, like livestock or crates. The lantern moved away. The door shut. The strap began its slow scrape again, and the dormitory sank back into that practiced quiet. Outside, the boy slid along the wall to the corner and looked down at the town. His face wasn't panicked. It was decided. Elena understood that look even without words. Whatever was happening up here, it was tied to the sheriff's lamp down there, and John Town was sitting in a cell with nothing but his rope scar and his patience. They went down the hill faster than they came, still careful, but with urgency now. Willow Bend lay below like a scatter of dark shapes and weak lanterns. The sheriff's office, of course, was the cleanest light in the whole place, steady and bright, like it was proud of itself. 2 deputies sat on the sheriff's porch. One told a joke and laughed too loud. The other shifted in his chair, coin or tobacco working between his fingers. Men like that were always bored, right up until they weren't. The boy watched them from behind the water trough. Elena crouched behind him. He pointed toward a small side window, then mimed squeezing through. Elena stared at him like he'd suggested walking into a furnace. But then she swallowed and nodded, because fear doesn't offer better options, only choices. The window was latched from inside. The boy slid the tip of his knife into the seam and twisted gently. A soft click. He eased it open, careful as a thief with a conscience. He slipped through first, landing inside without a sound. Elena followed, less graceful, her boots scraping wood just slightly. She winced, holding her breath, waiting for someone to shout. No shout came. Inside, the sheriff's office smelled like oil lamp and polished wood. Too neat, too controlled. The boy and Elena moved through shadows toward the back, where iron bars cut the room into a darker corner. John Town sat inside the cell with his back straight, listening to the building like it was telling him secrets. When he saw them, relief flickered across his face, then anger. He'd told them to stay. He'd meant it, not because he wanted to control them, but because he didn't want their courage to get them killed. The boy lifted his knife as if to answer the argument with a single word. No. Elena moved to the lock, hands trembling. John leaned close to the bars and nodded toward the desk. The key was on a hook. The boy slipped away, silent, hugging the shadows. He reached the hook, lifted the key ring, and returned. Elena took the key, shoved it into the lock, and turned. For a moment it resisted, then it gave. The cell door opened. John stepped out like a man stepping out of a coffin, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the shape of captivity. He gripped Elena's hands briefly to steady her, then released it. Not romance, not comfort, just a promise of balance. They moved toward the back door. Then Elena's boot betrayed her again. A floorboard creaked. Outside, one deputy paused mid-laugh. He tilted his head. The silence on the porch sharpened. John froze. The boy got still. Elena looked like she might stop breathing entirely. The door handle rattled. The porch door opened a crack and the deputy's face appeared squinting into the dim light. John moved first. He grabbed the revolver off the rack near the desk and struck.
By dawn, they were well clear of Willow Bend, riding into country that didn't care who wore a badge and who didn't. Out there, the land doesn't take sides. It just watches what you do with your breath. That's how they told it to me later. John Town with his shoulder tight and his eyes always on the next ridge. Elena wrapped in a blanket like she could stitch herself back together with cloth. And that Navajo boy riding close, quiet as a shadow. The horses ran hard through scrub and broken ground, dust trailing low behind them like smoke that hadn't decided where to rise. They finally slowed in a dry wash lined with boulders, the kind of place sound gets swallowed and secrets don't travel far. John dismounted first, all business, and checked Elena's bruises without asking permission. Not gentle, not rough, just practical. He wrapped her wrist where rope had rubbed the skin raw, hands steady like he'd done it 100 times for men who didn't deserve it and a few who did. Elena watched him like she didn't know what to do with a kindness that didn't come with strings. She asked him why he was helping. John didn't give her poetry. He just said he was already involved, like that was the whole truth. And maybe for him it was. Elena laughed once, short and bitter, like even the word involved sounded dangerous. The boy stayed a little apart, crouched in the sand. While John tied the last knot, the boy stared at the ground the way some men stare at a wanted poster. His eyes traced a line through the wash, following hoof prints and boot marks so fresh the edges still looked sharp. John saw the change in the boy's posture and walked over. One look at those tracks and John's jaw tightened. Jacone's men, or men like them. Too many hooves, too many heavy steps. The kind of trail that says they're not out here for a friendly visit. They didn't argue about it. They moved. They climbed toward higher ground where scattered pines began to show up, thin and stubborn, growing where they had no business growing. The air up there got cooler, but it didn't get kinder. Wind moved through the branches with a dry whisper that sounded like someone talking just out of reach. Then the boy stopped, so suddenly John nearly rode into him. Under a juniper lay an animal, at first glance, a dog. But it was bigger than a dog. Thick shoulders, long muzzle, gray-black coat like storm clouds. One leg was caught in a rusted trap, the metal biting deep. The animal's eyes were amber and furious with pain, and its lips pulled back just enough to promise it still had teeth. Elena made a small gasp, half prayer. John approached slow, palms low, the way you approach anything that can decide to tear you open. The animal growled, deep and steady. John hesitated, then glanced at the boy like he was asking, without words, whether this was a bad idea. The boy stepped closer than anyone should have. He didn't flinch. He made a low sound in his throat. No English, no Spanish, nothing polite. Just a rhythm, calm and steady, like he was reminding the animal it wasn't alone. And the strange thing was, it worked. The growl softened. The animal's ears shifted, listening. John crouched and worked the trap with his knife. The spring resisted. He cursed under his breath, then forced it open with a hard twist of steel and muscle. The trap released with a harsh jerk, and the animal yanked its leg free and staggered up, swaying. For a moment, it looked like it might lunge. Instead, it pressed its muzzle against the boy's shoulder, just a quick touch, like a signature. Then it stepped back, panting. The boy tore a strip of cloth from his own bundle and wrapped the injured leg tight. No fuss, no gentleness for show. Just a clean bandage, snug enough to hold. The animal sat for a breath, like it was deciding what kind of world this was. Then it stood and followed. John shook his head and said something dry about them collecting strays now. Elena managed a small, tired smile and told him it was better than collecting enemies. John snorted like he didn't know the difference anymore.
They traveled until evening with that limping wolf dog behind them. John called it Cinder because its coat looked like something that had burned down and kept living anyway. The boy didn't argue, and that alone told you something. He didn't waste words on what didn't matter. He just kept one hand on Cinder's neck when the animal got too close, steadying it like you'd steady a frightened horse. That night they camped under pines. John built a small fire, small enough not to advertise, big enough to keep the cold from crawling into bones. Elena ate dried meat and stared into the flames like she was trying to remember what it felt like to be safe. The boy sat with Cinder, murmuring soft sounds in his own language. The fire lit his face and made him look older than he had any right to look. When the stars came out sharp overhead and the wind dropped into that tense quiet it gets before trouble, Elena finally spoke again. She talked about Jacone like she'd swallowed poison and couldn't spit it out. She said he traded rifles, new, beautiful rifles, for whatever kept him powerful. She said he used everybody, sold guns to one side, promises to the other, and called it order when it benefited him. Then she mentioned the ledgers, names, numbers, deals written down like sins kept tidy. John's head lifted a fraction at that. Not surprise, recognition. Like he'd always known Jacone's power wasn't just in bullets, but in paperwork. Elena said she copied pages once, just enough to know Jacone wasn't only selling guns, he sold people too. Children. He called them wards, like that made it clean. The wind moved through the pine tops with a whisper. The boy's hands tightened in Cinder's fur so hard the animal shifted. John stared into the fire, the flames catching in his eyes, and you could tell something in him settled into place. Not rage, decision. John said they didn't just run anymore, they cut the line. The boy looked up at him, eyes bright in the firelight, and made a tight pulling gesture toward his own chest, like he was claiming the fight as his own. Then, like it cost him something, he spoke a single English word, rough and heavy. Father. That word dropped into the firelight like a stone into a still pond. John nodded once, slowly, and he didn't need more. He didn't need more. Cinder let out a low growl toward the darkness beyond the fire, and every head turned the same direction. John's hand went to his revolver. The boy's posture tightened. Elena hugged her blanket closer. But nothing stepped out. Only the wind, pacing the tree line like it had its own patience. And in that moment, with the fire small and the night wide, it was clear. Jacone wasn't just behind us, he was ahead too, waiting somewhere in the dark, like a debt that doesn't forget your name.
Later on, when people tried to explain what happened at Black Rock, they'd lower their voices without even meaning to, because that canyon has a way of shrinking a man's courage. The walls are dark and steep, like the earth split its teeth and decided to show them. Sound doesn't travel right down there. It gets swallowed, chewed up, and handed back in pieces. Johntown, Elena, and the Navajo boy reached it after days of hard riding and harder choices. They didn't walk in like visitors. They climbed to a ridge first and looked down, letting the land tell them what kind of trouble was waiting. At the bottom of the canyon, Jacone's camp sat tucked against the black stone, wagons tight together, men moving easy, rifles stacked like firewood. And on the far side, a second group waited, Apache riders, still and watchful, their horses steady as carved rock. Nobody was smiling down there except the men who thought they were getting rich. Elena saw the rifles and went pale. She didn't have to say a word. John could read it on her face. Jacone was making the trade right now. John didn't waste time arguing with what couldn't be changed in the moment. He scanned the camp like he was counting exits from a burning building. Then his eyes found the wagon he wanted, the one with the small iron safe bolted to the bed. A safe like that isn't for cash you spend in town. It's for secrets you can't afford to lose. John's plan was simple, and that's what made it dangerous. Slip in, take the ledger, get out before Jacone realized the truth had walked away. But even a simple plan needs a distraction, and the boy understood that before anyone said it out loud. He pointed toward the far side of camp, where the horses were tethered, then looked at John. It wasn't a question, it was an offer. He'd draw the eyes, John and Elena would do the stealing. John hesitated, just long enough to show he knew what he was asking of a kid. Then he nodded once. Trust, given sparingly, the kind you don't take back. John and Elena slipped through a narrow crack in the rock, shoulders scraping stone, dust falling in soft sheets. They came out low on the canyon floor, moving in the wagon shadows. Elena kept her head down,
The blanket gone now, her bruises still there, but her fear sharpened into focus. She reached the safe and pulled a thin wire from her hair like it had been hiding there all her life. Her hands trembled just a little, but she kept them steady enough to work. That's what survival looks like up close, shaking hands that still get the job done. While she worked the lock, John kept his eyes on the camp. Jacone stood between the two groups like he was hosting a polite business meeting. He opened a crate and let the Apache man lift a rifle, weigh it, test it. The metal gleamed in the daylight, beautiful in a way that made your stomach turn, because you knew what it was made for. Then one of Jacone's men wandered toward the wagons with a bottle, half drunk, half careless. John pressed tighter into shadow. The man stopped close enough that John could smell whiskey on him. For a second, the man's eyes drifted over the place where John crouched, over it, not on it, then slid away again. He took another step and frowned, like he'd heard something. That's when the growl came. Low, not loud, just enough to turn a head. And then from the far side of camp, horses screamed. Ropes snapped, hooves tore up dirt. The whole horse line surged like a wave breaking loose, smashing into crates and knocking men off their feet. Shouts went up, men ran, hats flew. Everything turned sideways in the space of a breath. That was the boys' work, and Cinder's. John didn't see it happen from where he was, but later you could stitch it together. The boy had gotten in close, cut ropes fast, spooked the horses at the right moment, and let panic do the rest. A stampede doesn't care who's guilty. On the far wall, the Apache rider shifted, hands moving toward rifles, not eager to fight, just ready in case the deal turned into a trap. Jacone raised both arms and spoke to them like he was calming a room full of nervous children. His smile never left. He was still trying to control the story. At the safe, Elena's wire finally clicked. The lock gave. Inside was the ledger, tied papers, and a pouch of gemstones that caught the light like trapped stars. Elena stared like she couldn't believe wickedness kept such pretty trophies. John didn't admire anything. He grabbed the ledger and shoved papers into his coat. "Take what you can carry," he muttered. Then the air changed. Jacone's head turned toward the wagons, slow and certain, like a man who just smelled smoke inside his own house. His gaze went straight to the shadows, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a satisfied one, like the game had finally become worth playing. "Marshalltown, or whatever you're calling yourself this week," Jacone called out, easy as conversation. There wasn't any point hiding. John rose from behind the wagon with his revolver up, body angled to shield Elena. Men's heads snapped toward him, rifles lifted. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. That's when the boy appeared again through the chaos, moving fast, braid whipping, face set hard. Cinder limped beside him, still dangerous, still loyal. A shooter tried to get a clear line, and Cinder launched, clamping onto the man's leg and dragging him down in the dirt. The boy grabbed the fallen rifle. He held it awkwardly, but there was nothing weak about the way he stood with it. He didn't fire. He didn't need to. He just dared the world to take one more thing from him. Elena screamed when a bullet ripped through the wagon canvas inches from her face. John shoved her down behind cover. They tried to move for the rock crack, the way they'd come, but 3 mounted men surged into position, cutting them off. Horses snorted, rifles leveled. Jacone strolled closer through the dust like he had all the time in the world. He offered choices that weren't choices, smiling like it hurt him to be reasonable. John's eyes flicked past him, toward a dark opening in the canyon wall, an old mine shaft, timbered, half collapsed, a mouth missing teeth. John didn't explain, he just moved. He grabbed Elena and drove them toward the mine, the boy and Cinder right behind. Bullets snapped off stone, dust jumped underfoot, and then they plunged into darkness. Daylight vanished like a curtain dropped. The mine swallowed sound, swallowed color, swallowed comfort. Behind them, voices echoed at the entrance, boots and lantern light following. Inside that black tunnel, with the ledger pressed to Elena's chest and the boy's breathing sharp beside him, John Town kept moving forward. And somewhere in the deep, as if the earth itself was listening, that thin, eerie whistle of the wind found its way in after them, turning the mine's darkness into something that felt almost alive.
When they ran into that mine, it wasn't like stepping into a room. It was like stepping into a throat. Darkness pressed in close, thick and wet, and the air had that stale smell of old timber and cold stone, like the place had been holding its breath for years. Their footsteps scraped over grit and broken rail, and every sound they made came back at them twice, warped and distant, as if the mine didn't like company. John struck a match and lit Elena's lantern. The flame caught and steadied, and suddenly the tunnel existed again.
Rough beams, damp walls, rails half buried in dust, and scratch marks on the rock that looked too deliberate to be accidents. The light didn't make it safer, it just made it real. Elena held the lantern tight and kept the ledger pressed to her chest like it could stop a bullet. The Navajo boy moved ahead a few steps, eyes adjusting faster than the others, his body low and ready. Cinder limped beside him, fur bristling, growling softly at pockets of blackness like he could smell something hiding. Behind them, far back at the entrance, they heard it, boots and voices echoing along the tunnel. Yacona's men had come in after them. Their lantern light flickered in the distance like moving stars in a dead sky. John pushed them deeper. He didn't talk much. He didn't have breath to waste. The tunnel forked. One path sloped down into colder air that smelled damp, like rot and water. The other climbed slightly, stale but drier. They stopped, all three of them listening, and for a moment the mind felt like it was listening too. The boy crouched and put his palm on the ground. John watched him, surprised again by how much the kid could read without words. The boy stayed still, feeling for vibrations, then pointed to the right-hand tunnel. No doubt in the motion. John trusted him and turned right. A little way in, the tunnel widened into a chamber supported by thick beams. Old crates sat stacked against the wall, blackened by time. A rusted ore cart lay on its side, like a dead beetle. And in the lantern light, something glinted on the ground. Treasure. Coins, Spanish silver and old gold, scattered like someone had poured out a lifetime and walked away. Bundles of metal, a few bars, enough to buy land and men and silence. Elena lifted the lantern and gasped, her mouth forming a prayer without sound. John stepped closer and picked up one coin, turning it between his fingers. He didn't look impressed. He looked sick, because money like that never comes clean, not down here. And then the boy saw the chains. Small shackles, child-sized. He didn't look at the gold anymore. He stared at the iron like it was a memory that had crawled out of the dark. His breathing changed, faster, sharper. Something in him tightened so hard it looked painful. From deeper in the chamber came a sound so faint John almost missed it. A whimper. The boy moved first, crossing the chamber toward a shadowed corner. He lifted the lantern high, and the light fell on two children huddled together like they'd learned to be smaller than fear. Thin, dirty, hair hacked short, eyes too wide, bodies too still. Elena knelt, hands trembling. Whatever she whispered sounded like grief caught in a throat. One child reached out as if to touch her, then flinched back, as if touch had always meant punishment. The boy crouched and murmured softly in Diné, voice low and steady. The children stared at his braid, then at Cinder sitting nearby like a wounded guardian, and something in them eased a fraction. Not trust, not yet, but less terror. John's jaw clenched. He looked at the shackles, the treasure, the children, and the shape of the truth came together like a rope tightening. Yacone wasn't just selling rifles. He was feeding children into the system and calling it business. Elena clutched the ledger harder. She whispered that the book proved it, if they lived long enough to carry it out. That if hung in the air, because the voices behind them were closer now, louder, men moving with confidence, drawn by the sound of their own greed. John scanned the chamber fast. Back the way they came was death waiting patiently. But at the far end, half hidden behind stacked crates, there was a narrow crack in the rock, an exit just wide enough for desperation. He pointed. That way. Elena nodded, swallowing fear. She grabbed one child with her free hand, ledger tucked tight under her arm. The boy lifted the other child carefully, like he understood exactly how fragile a person can become. Cinder stayed close, teeth bared at the darkness behind them. John turned back to buy them time. He shoved the crate hard, tipping it over. Coins spilled across the floor in a bright metallic clatter that echoed through the chamber like a dinner bell. Men love money more than caution, and John knew it. Then he heaved the ore cart onto the tracks. Metal screeched. He shoved it forward and let it roll into the tunnel behind him, rattling and gaining speed, a blunt, loud threat in the dark. He didn't wait to see who it hit. Elena squeezed through the crack first, shoulder scraping stone. The boy followed with the children. Cinder forced his way through last with a low, pained grunt. John stayed in the chamber, revolver raised, watching the tunnel mouth. Lantern beams swung into view. A man shouted, thrilled, "Gold!" and boots rushed forward, the mind filled with the sound of greed. And then Yacones stepped into the chamber, lantern in one hand, pistol in the other, calm as a man in his own parlor. He looked at John and smiled like they were old friends. His eyes flicked to the rope scar on John's throat, and the smile sharpened. "You should have stayed dead," Yacone murmured, close enough to make it.
Out in the high country, the night air has a way of telling you the truth. It doesn't shout it, it just lays it on your skin. Cold, sharp, impossible to ignore. John Town crawled out of that narrow crack in the rock like a man being born a second time. His hands were scraped raw, his mouth tasted like dust, and his head rang with the memory of stone collapsing behind him. Above the pines, the stars looked close enough to touch, bright and indifferent, the kind of sky that makes you feel small even when you're angry. He got to his feet slowly, one shoulder held tight, and started toward the only light he could see, lantern glow bobbing between tree trunks. The clearing opened up ahead like a stage set for something ugly. Elena was there, kneeling beside one of the rescued children, whispering comfort with a voice that wouldn't stop shaking. The other child clung close to the Navajo boy's side, small hands twisted into his shirt like they were afraid the wind might steal him too. Cinder sat nearby, panting through pain, watching the darkness beyond the trees with the focus of a guard dog that doesn't sleep. And standing a few yards away, calm as ever, was Jacone. He held Elena's lantern up as if it were a glass of whiskey. Two of his men flanked him with rifles leveled, their faces hard and hungry. Jacone's smile was bright enough to be polite, which somehow made it worse. "You see," his expression seemed to say, "everything comes back to me." Elena clutched the ledger tight to her chest, leather and paper, the kind of proof men kill for. Jacone spoke to her like he was negotiating a business deal, offering a choice he'd already decided the outcome of. Hand over the ledger and he'd keep things simple. Elena looked at him and understood what simple meant to a man like that. The Navajo boy didn't move, but his whole body held tension like a drawn bow. His eyes never left Jacone. Not hate alone, something older, something that had been carried a long time without words. John stepped into the edge of the clearing, and for a moment the world narrowed to distance and angles. 2 rifles, 1 pistol, 1 lantern, 2 children, a wounded wolf dog, a woman holding the truth, and a boy whose rage had finally found its target. Then John heard it. Hoofbeats, faint but growing, coming through the trees from the south slope. Not Jacone's. Too many. Too steady. Jacone heard it too. His smile faltered just a fraction, and that fraction was all John needed. John fired. One of Jacone's riflemen dropped hard, hit clean, his rifle slipping from his hands and thudding into pine needles. The second rifleman panicked and fired back, the shot tearing bark from a tree and spraying splinters into the cold air. Cinder launched like a dark shadow with teeth, slamming into the shooter's legs and dragging him down. The rifle skittered across the dirt. The boy snatched it up. He held it awkwardly, but he held it with absolute intent. He didn't fire. He didn't need to. He stood there like a warning. Jacone, still smiling, drew his pistol and aimed at Elena. John moved without thinking. He shoved Elena down, shielding her with his body. Jacone's shot cracked and hit dirt close enough to kick dust into her hair. Elena clamped her arms around the ledger like it was her last heartbeat. The hoofbeats arrived all at once. Navajo riders burst into the clearing, men on horseback, faces stern, moving with the kind of control that comes from living in hard country. They spread out and formed a loose circle, rifles raised, not firing yet, measuring. They weren't there for a speech. They were there because a boy had gone missing, because children had been stolen, because the wind carries news when people pay attention. Jacone's mouth tightened. For the first time, the calm looked strained. John stepped forward, gun steady, blood already soaking his shoulder where old pain lived and new pain was about to join it. Jacone's smile returned, thinner now. He glanced at the boy and spoke like a man who enjoyed his confidence. "Nothing ends," he implied. "It just changes hands." Then Jacone threw the lantern to the ground. Glass shattered. Flame flared up briefly, bright and hungry, painting faces in orange for a heartbeat. In that flare, Jacone fired at John. The bullet tore into John's shoulder. John grunted, rocked back, but stayed on his feet. A lot of men fall when they get hit. John Town had already been hanged once. Falling wasn't his habit.
He fired back. Jacone jerked as the shot hit low near the ribs. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with outrage, like pain was something he didn't believe he deserved. He stumbled backward toward the slope behind them, where loose shale slid into darkness. The boy took one step forward, face twisted with something too heavy for his years. Jacone looked at him and rasped something like a joke, something like a challenge, still trying to make the boy small. The boy answered in Diné, just one short sentence, steady and final. Not a scream, not a curse, the kind of words you say when you're done being chased by a memory. Jacone didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. He laughed once, wet and broken, and then his boot slipped on loose stone. He reached for purchase, found nothing, and rolled down into the trees, swallowed by the dark with a clatter of rocks like thrown bones. Silence rushed into the clearing. Not peace, just the sudden absence of Jacone's voice. John swayed, pressing his hand to his shoulder. Elena crawled to him and shoved her palm against the wound, trying to hold him together with sheer will. The riders held position, watchful, letting the moment settle. The wind moved through the pines again, and with it came that thin whistling note, soft now, like someone finally letting out a breath they'd been holding. John reached up with his good hand and lifted the rope over his head. He didn't make a show of it, no speech, no victory. He just removed it and let it drop to the ground. Hemp hit dirt with a dull, ordinary sound, like it never mattered, even though it had nearly killed him. The boy watched that rope fall,